Dusty Gulch, Arizona. Territory 1883. Eleanor Grant had learned over 3 long years exactly how a room could reject a person without ever saying a word out loud. She stood just inside the doorway of the Silver Dollar Saloon on a Thursday evening in October, her crutch tucked under one arm, the polished wooden peg beneath her skirts settling unevenly on the warped floorboards, and watched every man in the room find somewhere else to look, somewhere safer, somewhere that did not require deciding what to say to her. Conversations did not stop. They just quietly closed ranks around her. A room deciding together without a word passed between them that acknowledging her presence for longer than a glance would cost something none of them wanted to pay. Nobody offered her a chair. Nobody offered her anything at all. Not even the courtesy of acknowledging she had walked in. She had come only to collect payment on Harlan Booth's mended coat, and Harlan himself would not meet her eyes long enough to hand her the coins properly, dropping them onto the bar instead of into her palm, the way a man drops a coin for a beggar rather than pays a debt to a woman who had sewn him an honest coat. Her hand rose to her chest, the old habit of steadying a breath that had gone shallow and quick without her permission. Then a chair scraped back at a corner table loud enough in the sudden quiet that half the room turned to look. A cowboy, she did not recognize dark curling hair beneath a weathered hat, a few days' road dust still on his duster coat, pulled the second chair out from his own table and looked at her, like she was simply a woman standing in a doorway, nothing more complicated than that. "Sit with me," he said simply. The whole saloon went quiet in an entirely different way than it had a moment before. Before the piano, there had been horses. The Grant family had bred and broken mustangs on a spread west of town until Eleanor was 12 back before. Her father sold the herd and the land both to pay off a bad year. And she still remembered exactly how to talk low to a spooked animal, how to plant her feet and drop her voice into something a frightened creature could trust, a skill she had not needed in over a decade, folded away like a dress she had outgrown but never quite thrown out. She had played piano at the Silver Dollar since she was 17, untrained but naturally gifted, the kind of player who could read a room's mood and match it before anyone realized that was what they had wanted to hear. Men who could not carry a tune themselves would request the same 3 songs from her for months just to hear her make something ordinary sound like it mattered. It had been for 8 years the one place in Dusty Gulch where she felt entirely herself. The accident happened on a June afternoon 3 years back. A freight wagon's team spooked by a rattlesnake near the schoolhouse. 6-year-old Lily Hargrove frozen in the road directly in its path, too startled by the noise to move a single step. Eleanor had not thought about it, not the way people later insisted she must have. She had simply moved, shoving the girl clear with both hands, and had not been fast enough to clear herself. The town had been grateful for a while. They brought food, sat vigil during the fever that followed, told her repeatedly how brave she had been. But gratitude curdled fast once the crisis passed, and the discomfort of her presence remained the crutch, the uneven gait, the visible reminder that safety was never as guaranteed as people liked to pretend. She had stopped playing piano the week she came back to town. Nobody had asked her to stop. Nobody had needed to. She could feel it in the way requests dried up, the way conversations paused a beat too long when she entered a room. There was a difference between a room going silent out of respect and a room going silent out of relief that you would soon be leaving it. She took up sewing instead, steady private work behind a closed shop door, work that asked nothing of anyone's carefully managed politeness. Thomas Whitaker had ridden into Dusty Gulch 4 days earlier with a trail crew delivering 400 head to the rail depot, part of the steady traffic of Arizona cattle pushed north each season to meet the rail lines and the eastern markets waiting at the other end of them. And he knew exactly nobody's history in that town, the entire reason the evening went the way it did. He was 29, quiet, in the way of a man who had done most of his talking already and found it had not fixed much. 3 years before, in a New Mexico county, he did not discuss his wife Clara, and the child she was carrying had died when a wagon overturned crossing a swollen creek, an accident nobody's fault, the kind that leaves a man with nowhere to point his anger except weather and luck, neither of which answers back. He had buried her, and 3 weeks later buried the small wooden marker he had carved for the child that never got a name and rode out of that county before the ground had properly settled over either grave, telling himself it was practical to move on to where the work was. He knew even then it was really just easier to keep moving than to sit still with what he had lost. He had taken a corner table at the Silver Dollar that Thursday simply because it was quiet nursing a whiskey he was not in any hurry to finish when he noticed a woman standing in the doorway being very deliberately not noticed by an entire room. He did not know she had once played that piano gathering dust in the corner. He only saw what was actually in front of him, a woman with nowhere to sit in a room full of empty chairs. And something about that plain unfairness moved him before he had fully decided to move. He had not planned to say anything at all. The chair was already scraping back before the thought had finished forming. She sat because refusing would have meant standing in that doorway even longer, and because his face had not asked her to be grateful for the gesture, it had simply made it the way a person holds a door. "Thomas Whitaker," he said, passing through with the Bar M herd 400 head bound for the rail cars. "Eleanor Grant," she said quietly, and waited for the question that usually followed. It did not come. "You always collect debts in saloons?" he asked, instead nodding at the coins still sitting on the bar where Harlan had left them. "Only from men too much of a coward to hand them over properly," she said, and heard her own voice come out sharper and more herself than it had in longer than she wanted to admit. Something almost like a laugh crossed his face. "I will go collect them for you, if you would like to see him flinch twice in one evening. I can manage my own collecting, Mr. Whitaker." "Did not say you could not," he said. "Sod, I would enjoy watching." They talked for the better part of an hour cattle prices, the Arizona heat a story about a green colt that had put him in a horse. Trough his first week on the Bar M ordinary conversation of a kind she had not been offered in 3 years' conversation that assumed she was simply a person capable of finding things funny, not a situation to be managed. "You play?" he asked at one point, nodding toward the piano gathering dust in the corner. "Used to," she said, and left it there waiting to see whether he would push. "Shame," he said simply, and moved the conversation elsewhere. And she understood he had read the closed door in her answer and had no interest in forcing it. Nobody had done that either, not in 3 years. Most people either avoided the piano entirely, tiptoeing around it like a grave, or pushed at it with the well-meaning insistence of people convinced that forcing her back onto the bench would somehow fix what the accident had broken. When she finally stood to leave, he stood too and did not offer his arm, correctly reading that she had not asked for it. "Evening, Miss Grant," he said. "Hope Dusty Gulch treats you kinder than tonight," suggested. She walked home, turning that sentence over the whole way, unable to remember the last time someone had noticed the unkindness at all, let alone said so plainly as though it were simply a fact about the town rather than a fact about her that needed managing. The Bar M needed extra hands through the fall roundup, and Thomas took the work. He came by the dress shop the following week with a torn shirt sleeve that did not strictly need Eleanor's mending skills so much as it needed an excuse. And she recognized the excuse for exactly what it was and mended the sleeve anyway. Her leg had been fitted 18 months after the accident with a jointed wooden and leather prosthetic built by a traveling limb maker out of Phoenix, one of a growing number of craftsmen who had learned the trade fitting Civil War veterans too, decades before, and carried the skill west with the railroads following demand created by mining accidents and farm machinery as much as the war ever had. It let her walk without the crutch on smooth ground, though stairs and uneven floors still demanded it. And she had spent a year learning exactly how much weight to trust it, with how to shift her hip just so through a turn before she trusted it in public at all. The fitting had cost more than 3 months of sewing work borrowed against future orders, and paid back slowly, one hemmed skirt at a time. Thomas asked about it directly once the 3rd week. He just asked flat and easy, like he was checking on a fence post instead of a wound. "Does it ache?" "Some days," she said. "Less than people expect, more than I let on." "Fair enough," he said, and did not press further, which she had come to understand was simply how he handled most things that were not his business to fix. What she did not tell him was what the leg still cost her 2 years on, not the money, though, that had not stopped either, but the daily arithmetic of deciding which floors were safe, which invitations were worth the risk of Stairs, which rooms she would rather not enter at all. That ledger never balanced. She simply kept paying it every single day and had stopped expecting anyone to notice the bill. This story from Wild West Haley Stories already found its way to places I did not expect when I sat down to write it. Brazil, Nigeria, India, the Philippines, corners of the world I am only starting to learn. If Eleanor and Thomas are keeping you good company tonight, a like helps more than you would think. Tell me where you are watching from. I read every comment. Now, not everyone in Dusty Gulch is glad to see Eleanor smiling again, and one woman in particular is about to make that very clear. Beatrice Caldwell ran the town social committee the way some men ran cattle empires, and she had strong opinions about the Founders' Day dance, now 3 weeks off, and stronger ones still about the sight of a ranch drifter spending his evenings at Eleanor Grant's dress shop. Beatrice's voice in the flat, certain tone of a woman thoroughly convinced her own cruelty was concern. It is simple practicality. A man ought to know what he is taking on before he takes it on. She cannot dance, cannot run a household the way a whole woman can, and it is a mercy to say so plainly before feelings get further involved than they ought. Word reached Thomas within the week, delivered by his own foreman with the awkward duty of a man passing along gossip he did not fully endorse but felt obligated to mention. "Just so you are not caught unaware," the foreman said. "Some in town think you are being kind to her out of pity. Others think you do not know what you are getting into." "And what do you think?" Thomas asked. The foreman considered it honestly. "I think Miss Grant laughs more since you rode in than she has in 3 years I have known her. Seems worth something whatever the rest of them are saying." Thomas turned that over the rest of the day mending fence alone on the far side of the property, where he had time to think without company. He had heard talk like Beatrice Caldwell's before in the county he had left. Neighbors who had meant well and said cruel things anyway, certain their own. Comfort was simply common sense, and he had let that kind of talk push him out of a place once already. He found turning it over now no appetite for letting it push him out of this one. He did not repeat any of it to Eleanor. She heard it herself 2 days later, standing behind a display of bolt cloth in the Mercantile while Beatrice Caldwell discussed the matter with another woman entirely unaware Eleanor was within earshot. Mercy Beatrice Caldwell had called it a mercy to say so, plainly the sort of word that dressed itself up as kindness while doing the exact work of cruelty. Eleanor left without buying the cloth she had come for and spent that evening doing the arithmetic she had sworn off 3 years before measuring exactly how much of Thomas Whitaker's attention was genuine interest and how much was the kindness a decent man extends to something broken, the way he might feed a stray dog without ever intending to keep it. When he came by the shop the next afternoon, she was distant in a way he had not seen since their first evening at the Silver Dollar. "Something happened?" he asked. "Nothing happened," she said, which was true in the narrowest possible sense and false in every other one. He did not push that day. He had gone quiet on someone before once and let silence make the decision instead of him, watched it cost him nearly everything worth having. He was not about to make that mistake twice, not with this one. But he also knew better than to force a door open before she was ready to unlatch it herself. So he simply stayed a while longer than the visit called for, saying nothing until the worst of her weariness had somewhere to settle. He found her 2 evenings later at the split-rail fence behind her shop, where she went most evenings to watch the sun drop behind the Bradshaw range the sky, turning a deep and probably gentle orange over the whole valley. "Somebody has been telling you I am here out of pity," he said, not a question. She did not answer, which was answer enough. "I buried a wife and a child that never got born," he said, 3 years back in a creek crossing that should not have killed anybody. "I have spent every year since making sure I never had anywhere solid enough under me to lose again, told myself that was just how a drifter lives, like it was a philosophy instead of a way of hiding. Then I sat down across a table from a woman nobody in this town would look at, and for the first time in 3 years I wanted to stay somewhere long enough to see what happened next. That is not pity, Eleanor. Pity does not make a man want to build something, it just makes him feel better about walking away. You do not know what people are saying," she said, quiet, watching the last of the light go instead of looking at him. "What it costs being seen. With me. I know exactly what they are saying," he said. "My foreman already warned me." I came to the fence line instead of turning my horse around, if that answers the question you are actually asking." She was quiet a long moment, the sun nearly gone behind the mountains, the first stars starting to show over the ridgeline. "Beatrice Caldwell is going to make the dance difficult," she said finally, "for both of us if you are seen with me there." "Then we better go anyway," Thomas said, not to prove anything to her, "just because I would like to dance with you, and I do not intend to let a woman with strong opinions about mercy talk either of us out of it." He did not know it yet, but that decision would cost them both a great deal more than an evening of stares before the week was out. The dance was held in the depot warehouse, cleared and swept and hung with lanterns for the occasion, the same depot that saw herds like the Bar M's, 400 head pushed through every season on their way to the rail cars and the eastern markets waiting at the other end of the line. The whole town's fortune tied one way or another to that stretch of track. Founders' Day was not just another gathering in a town like Dusty Gulch for most families on outlying spreads. It was the one night of the year they dressed in their better clothes and danced under a roof, the single evening a hardscrabble farming community set aside on purpose to remember there was more to living out there than work and dust and distance from everything familiar. Eleanor arrived on Thomas's arm in the green dress she had finished sewing 3 nights before, and felt the room do the same thing it had done at the Silver Dollar conversations, closing quietly around her presence, though this time Thomas's arm stayed exactly where it was. Beatrice Caldwell found them within the first quarter hour, moving through the crowd with the brisk purpose of a woman who had been rehearsing a line all week. "How lovely you could join us, Miss Grant," she said in a voice pitched for the several nearby ears it was clearly intended for. "Though I do wonder whether the dance floor is quite suited to your circumstances. We would not want an accident." "We would not," Thomas said, before Eleanor could answer, "though I have noticed accidents mostly happen to people standing still, worrying too hard about what everyone is watching instead of paying attention to what is actually in front of them." He looked at Eleanor. "Care to dance, Miss Grant?" The band was mid-waltz when Thomas led her onto the floor and adjusted his stance without comment to match the rhythm her leg required. Shorter steps, weight held steady through the turns, nothing about it apologetic or careful in a way that drew attention to itself. She had not danced in 3 years. She had not expected to remember how, and for the first turn or two her whole body braced for a misstep that never came. His hand steady at her waist the entire time, adjusting a half beat before she needed him to rather than after. By the third pass she had stopped bracing entirely and simply danced, and for the length of that waltz Dusty Gulch watched a woman they had spent 3 years managing instead of knowing, and found they did not quite have the vocabulary left to keep doing the former. The trouble started with fireworks meant to mark the evening's close and a supply wagon team tied loosely outside the depot that had not been warned to expect the noise. The team bolted down Main Street directly toward the schoolhouse steps, where 3 children too young to know better were sitting to watch the fireworks. The street emptied of grown men fast enough that nobody quite reached the horses in time, nobody except Eleanor, who moved into the street on legs that had every reason to fail her and did not planted herself directly in the team's path and spoke to the lead horse in the low, steady voice her father had taught her before she had ever touched a piano key, before any of this town had decided what to make of her. Her leg buckled once under the strain of holding her ground against 900 pounds of frightened horse, and she felt it go and held anyway. Weight thrown onto the good leg and sheer stubbornness, the same stubbornness that had once shoved a 6-year-old clear of a runaway wagon without stopping to calculate the cost. She did not think about the leg at all in that moment, did not think about 3 years of careful arithmetic over which floors were safe and which invitations were not worth the risk. She just did the thing her hand still remembered how to do, the way a body remembers a skill long after the mind has stopped trusting it. The team stopped 4 feet from the children. Thomas reached her half a second later, breathing hard, and found her already stroking the horse's foam flat.